very happy to introduce Hamish Coates, who will share his research on innovative approaches to the 21st century student experience. Dr. Coates is professor at the Center for the Study of Higher Education at the University of Melbourne. He is also founding director of the Higher Education Research, founding director of Higher Education Research at the Australian Council for Educational Research, and he serves in many leadership positions on various initiatives and institutes in Australia. So anyway, join me in a very warm welcome to Dr. Hamish Coates.
Thank you. Thank you, Molly, for all the work setting this up, and indeed to Laurie, it was on the advisory committee for the project which forms the bulk of the presentation. I'm going to go very fast so we can have time for questions at the end. First of all, and this is not just for Molly, it's for everyone. Who's been to Australia? Okay, well, you will now be tested at the end. I'm going to teach you a little bit of Australian. This is actually my favourite word. Right? So you can get out of the exam in Australian if you use the word bonza. Let's all say it. Bonza. Yeah, that's it. Use it 3 times before the day's over. It's great. Right? Let's spread Australian around the world. You probably know what a billabong is. Avo, yeah? They're about $4 each in Australia, but I've just been in Texas and they're about 50 cents each, so I've had a few of them. And this is actually the reason that I don't do tourism in Australia myself, because you go and order a drink and someone says, no worries, and you sort of think, I'm here ordering a drink. Why on earth would I have a worry? But that actually means you're welcome in American, all right? So there's a lexicon, and that's by way of saying, if I speak too fast or speak Australian you don't understand, just jump straight in and let me know, okay? There's no simultaneous translation, but sometimes I will say a few things. Please come down, there's seats down the front here, once you've got a nibble and a drink. Okay, so first of all, today, I'm going to talk through about 3 or 4 different things, some shaping perspectives, some research developments, some innovative perspectives. They're at least the new things that we've discovered in this field over the last 2 years, and then some next steps. First of all, the shaping perspectives. This is always the reason why I find higher education research and development, that is the actual field of higher education research and development, to be fascinating. Very young field. It's all about these people and these kinds of questions. And these are really complex questions, and no one has a monopoly on wisdom in these areas, and in many cases, some of us are probably still asking some of these questions ourselves. I'm going to return to this question as I go throughout the presentation. These are the key questions that we're trying to find not only the answers to, but indeed how to answer. This is currently what many firms and governments and organisations and people sitting in their you know, I have a website, it was at the front, hamishcoates.com. I could go back to my hotel, beautiful hotel, the Kendall Hotel. I could put up in my own ranking tonight. I'm sure I could. And it may indeed be better than some of these. This currently is a problem, because even as a professor of higher education, I would have no idea how to make sense out of most of these things. What we have is what Akerlof, an American famous economist, do you know who Akerlof is? Yeah. He called the market for lemons. Is that what you call a car, you know, used car? And the problem with the market for lemons, are there any economists in the room? I'm almost going to ask you to explain it because I'm going to get it wrong. If I get this wrong, I get to give you a test in Australian as well. Okay, so that's the seal of silence. The problem is people are making uninformed consumption choices, which degrades the matching and their optimisation and their value creation that we can. They're not using higher education as best they might. And the really big problem for us is that then degrades higher education, because everything regresses to a certain point. And that's a communication issue. We also have a changing, so we need to get beyond that. We have a changing system. So this is sort of how it looked until fairly recently, probably the last 3, 4, 5 years. We had governments, higher education institutions, quality accreditation agencies, stakeholders and students. Whereas increasingly we have this sort of setup. We have quality agencies. The one in my country is being closed down. There's several that are being, the UK is in the process of closing theirs down. We have institutions, Governments have taken more of an ownership role because they put money in every country, by and large. And then we have these funny things called transparency technologies in the middle, and I'm going to return to them later on in the closing stages in terms of new ideas for reporting platforms that can help us do better by students and by institutions, do higher education better. Another shaping perspective is this. By and large, we've tended to assume that the institution does things to students, whereas increasingly we're aware that students are all constructing different institutions. You all construct MIT in different ways. Even on different days, you construct it in different ways. And I'm not just talking about branding and brand equity and marketing and ideas about how we think through who we are in a certain space with different sorts of people. I'm thinking more particularly about how we then understand how to articulate the value creation that goes on over this side. So here's my broad take. We need to move beyond myths and rituals. I was just talking before the seminar with Laurie about student feedback surveys, which I've done a lot of, which you'll see. But to a certain extent, we've got problems with them and limitations, as I'll say. We need to instead to spark new cycles of contribution and improvement for higher education, which means we need to think about it differently and we need to understand and develop it differently. And that fundamentally means we need new metrics and reporting systems, which is going to be the guts of my analysis. Is that an Australian phrase, the guts? Do you say that? Yeah? Okay. Maybe it's American. First of all, some research developments. And here I'm just going to trace some of my own trajectory through the field by way of giving you a sense as to where I landed about 3 years ago to make the contribution that's going to form the heart of the presentation. About 1970 or so, some people developed a survey in the UK called the Course Experience Questionnaire that measured these things. Actually, it measured different things, but when it was Australianised, some of those UK people came and lived in Australia, and when it was Australianised, it had that flavour. And from about 1989, we've run this nationally. So when you graduate from one of Australia's 40 universities, it's about 1.2 million students in Australia, 300,000 of which are international students. When you graduate, about 6 months after you're given a survey, well, at least until about 2 or 3 years ago, you were given a survey that asked you about those things. So hopefully they're fairly self-explanatory. It's about a 20-item survey. I first got engaged in higher education R&D in about 1998 when there was a push by some people who became colleagues to say higher education actually happens more outside the classroom than it does within the classroom in many instances. Campus is in fact the space between the buildings. So we broadened the idea of what we measured to include those sorts of things, which you can see are a lot more outcomes directed, a lot more social in spirit. And that was, I guess, one instance of me starting to see that higher education is more than a didactic experience and indeed more involves people walking around having serendipitous experiences as they meet colleagues and the like across campuses. Published the dissertation on campus-based students' engagement in online education, which is still the big, predominantly where online education happens, and came up with a taxonomy for understanding different sorts of students. How can we understand how students interact socially with their higher education experience? And what I observed from this is not so much that we can understand people in terms of their academic or social characteristics. It's that there were very few studies in the field of higher education that were looking at students rather than looking at the experiences or the students' reception of their higher education experience. In other words, they're very different customer-centric rather than supplier-centric views. So that sort of set me on a different path. Did a parallel piece of work with all of the training organisations in Australia. There's about 4,000 or 5,000 of them, ranging from the military through to people who train people how to cut hair, and managed to get through the conversations that took over a period of 5 years with the federal government and a lot of these organisations, a scale on learner engagement, and started to see how this was a basic education thing that resonated with people, and if framed right, could add enormous value to what we know about what's going on, even when you're training someone to be an electrician or a plumber. Right? Very traditional apprentice type, master apprentice trades, and we started to break them down in terms of some of these education notions. Then got a job and took this thing called the Nessie. Who's heard of the Nessie? National Survey of Student Engagement. It's been run out of Indiana University, Bloomington. As it happens, the director was one of my dissertation examiners. We have a strange system in Australia. Your dissertation is sent to two people who you don't know. They know you because they're examining it, but it's like double-blind peer review. And George was one of them. And then took his survey and internationalised it. So I did it initially with Australia and New Zealand over a period of about 4 or 5 years. And then through OECD work and various other work, it took shape around the world. So the China College Student Survey, which is probably the biggest student survey in the world, is now based on this piece of work coming out of Indiana University and summed up in that book on the far right, all the different country case studies. And it's still growing. What it does is it starts to look at the value creation or the value chain of students' participation in higher education, ranging from how we can understand their aspirations to engage, how we can understand the admissions integration, often a lot of hassle factor associated with this, a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety, particularly if you don't know what higher education is when you're 10, 11 or 12 years of age, and that's when most participation decisions are made, not towards the end of senior secondary at all. So how do we start to understand that? In fact, I discovered that through the application of the items that formed that bit of the survey over a couple of years in Australia. We said, when did you first decide to participate in higher education? It was 12, by and large, in junior school, middle school, do you say? Yeah. Which was fascinating. So it's cultural. Then looked at involvement, retention, and then finally how people go out and get jobs and do further study and do things in the community. And there's various sorts of underpinning parts to that. And these parts here are directly mapped across all these different countries so we can start to benchmark. And I'm going to show you a few of those results. These are things that I added in Australia, but some of them have now ricocheted around the different countries. One of the things I added was a question that asked students, you know, in Australia there's no financial penalty if a student drops out of an institution. The institution could just replace that student and they would get the same revenue. So just have a think about the incentives or otherwise that creates in terms of engaging and retaining people, even just retaining people in study. So we added a question, have you seriously considered departing higher education before graduation? And that's now been going, in fact, 2016 results were released about a month ago. They're now all on a website. Quite interesting. So something good has happened. Probably education being counter-cyclical, something happened here. We never had any recession in Australia. Australia's got the longest, apart from the Dutch, I think. I think we've now beaten the Dutch. We haven't had a recession in 20, 30, 40 years or something like this. But nonetheless, people probably still took some shelter in higher education. We haven't had a recession because we're really good at digging up a huge country and selling it to countries, principally China. It's not because we're geniuses, it's just dumb luck. We have a lot of coal and iron and the like. But increasingly, those markets are softening, those markets are becoming a lot more competitive, so higher education is becoming, it's the third biggest export in the country. Absolutely critical to our future prosperity. And so this sort of information is now really, really of political economic importance, not just educational, nice to have. Some institutions have got this is espoused attrition, did you say that? Intentions? So there's a gap between this and the people who actually go. My institution has an attrition rate of 5%. There are some that have 20 or 30%. So you can, that's the space to intervene, right? Between me saying I might go and the actual you say a trite? Actual departure, per se. You can go one step further and say why. Why have you considered leaving higher education? And I'm just trying to give you a flavour of the sort of information that we can get out of these kinds of data collections. And the really interesting thing here is most of the reasons that students give are things that we can do something about. This one?
You can carry on. No.
Oh, okay. We can do things about those top things. And so there's, you know, they're not structural things. The family hasn't moved interstate. That's better. Thanks. Boredom, I discovered through talking with people about these sorts of findings, is in fact a really fascinating topic. You can talk about boredom for a long time. Not clear what boredom means, but when you've got 22% of the students who say they were going to leave saying that they're going to leave because of boredom, there's something that the institution needs to do, and they can action accordingly through obviously more detailed follow-up with students. This information is actually taken off the website. All of this data is now publicly available, developed through a subsequent data collection that I'll talk about. We were able, for a review of funding of Australian higher education, to give to the government information on those sort of dimensions that I pointed out earlier. So just sort of show you, this is a completely technically evil thing to do, but when the government says we have no other information on the quality of teaching, learning in Australian higher education that's international, it's something that's kind of worthwhile doing. This is obviously an issue. So there we start to talk about, yeah?
Do you mind if I ask a
Sure.
question?
Yeah.
Can you go back one, please? To the list. So they were giving you more than one reason. Right?
They can give as many reasons as they want, yeah.
So I'm curious if there were bundles. Like, do any of these reasons belong together? Is there a meta reason structure?
I have a paper I can send you.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. But I wrote it about 10 years ago and I can't remember standing here. Yeah, we started off, well, I started off just by having an open text response, and then after we had about 100,000 responses, we sent it to the data processing centre and they came up with these categories. Yeah.
Somebody with family problems might also have health or stress.
Correct. You could have a dropout syndrome going on. Yep. These are just symptoms, if you like. Yeah. Many institutions wouldn't see this as a problem. In the States, that sounds very weird because if a student leaves, apart from the moral and educational and professional and civic there's a financial issue, which usually evokes the attention of leadership in ways that it just doesn't in Australia. Yeah, yeah, I have several papers on that actually. Student staff is the key to it. Okay, so isn't it funny that we do all of this work and we come up with the proposition that in an educational environment, students should have contact with their teachers? But it's good to have evidence, right? It's good to have evidence. I've spent 6 months of my life during my doctoral studies at Ann Arbor. Yes, it's a different type of institution than the Australian one that it's been benchmarked against. They're all what you'd call R1 institutions, right? That's why I selected them, because they're most easily internationally benchmarkable. But it's not so different that you should be seeing those different types of results. And living on campus, which we basically don't do in Australia, has nothing to do with it. There is an issue. And it's the issue to do with casualisation or the creation of a sessional academic workforce principally. So there's no faculty on campus. So in a lot of our institutions, our 50% of the teaching happens by people who are on 1 hour contracts. 1 hour contracts, a bit like the restaurant industry. So that's a problem. And it's a problem that you start to see there and then flows through to other quality concerns. But this is probably the biggest take home that I got. And in a way, when I figured this out, it was time to move on to something different. There's a guy called Graham Little. He did his PhD at Harvard actually back in the early 70s. And he wrote a book out of that called Faces on Campus, which is a fascinating book. I don't know Graham's field. He ended up teaching about the psychoanalysis of leadership. He's dead now. He died about a decade back. But Faces on Campus is a wonderful book, and he came up with this taxonomy. And he basically said you've got challenge and support. And you get it high-low, you get these sorts of criteria. So this is where both are low, and the top right is where you have a cultivating and enriching environment. And in fact, when we started to look within the, as it was called, Aussie data, and there's the SASI over in South Africa and various other things. We started to see that in fact that taxonomy was proven, and then you could go one step further to try and identify the characteristics that lead to that. And George, my examiner, who's now retired, living down in Florida, part-time, he seems to be more active than most of my colleagues, is now writing a lot about high-impact practices, HIPs. Okay, so there's a literature developing on that, and around student success, which is a topic I'll get back to later on. The government smelled something good. We have a government-funded system in Australia. It's still funded publicly, by and large, though there are some institutions, mine being one, that would claim that we get about 30% of money from the government, suggested that they could use this data for good ends to allocate public money. So they approached us and said, can you develop this thing? And in a way, that was a bit disappointing because we just had a lot of fun. Conferences, really good educational vibe with the Aussie, but also it gave the opportunity to sort of step back and say, well, some of those things were developed, as I now know, in a hotel just near O'Hare Airport back in about 1985 or such. At small, liberal arts, mostly male, US, New England colleges. Nothing against them. But that's a very different context than the context in Australia in 2012, 2011 as it was. Not least all of the international dimension of our student population. So it offered a chance to have a clean slate. And with a few colleagues, we stood back and we said, what really matters, taking everything into consideration? There's usually US perspectives, UK perspectives, increasing Asian perspectives. You know, Asia has the biggest higher education system in the world now, and they're doing work in this field across China and India and other countries. So these are the concepts we came up with. Inclusion's fairly straightforward, not just getting people in, admitting them, but actually making them part of our community. Supporting them, teaching them people's own engagement, and then the development of skills. Okay, there's a few reports that have been published on that, and that's the website that I've referred to a little bit, where you can see all the data reported. So about 6 months after the student fills out the survey, the information's on the web, and you can do all sorts of comparisons between institutions and see how they compare. I have no sense of how many people use that website. I've tried to, I'm not involved in the current project. It's run by a consulting firm, and there's very little information, but it's there if you want to use it. We also had some fun by measuring 5-year out graduate employment rates. Do you do that here? Does the alumni office do it? I guess they would. Our government is going to go, we did this as a survey in 2008 of everyone that graduated in 2002. We said, what are you doing in 3, 5 and 8? And this was something really fascinating. This is male, female salaries across all fields and all bachelor degree. So this is the salary in 2003, 5 and 8. Year 5 is 2008. We have higher salaries in Australia, generally, but our cost of living is higher. And to make up for it, our dollar is now about 75 cents to the US dollar. But that's fascinating. And we couldn't ask on the form, what's your current activity? We couldn't have a box saying you're pregnant, because it was a study funded by the government and that's illegal. But that would appear to explain some of that change there, as with different sorts of industries and things. But you can start to see something clicked for me, a really important insight into how people are progressing in terms of the value they're getting back from their investment in higher education. Of course, it's just money, but you can start to see when you look across all the fields and all the different institutions they came from, that some of the people who went to much less prestigious institutions, in fact, were much more easily aligned into work roles. We're constantly told by engineering firms that the engineers from the University of Melbourne aren't work ready enough. They're too academic. So these sorts of considerations in terms of how people move from the academic environment through the labour market started to click in terms of the value proposition of higher education. And then this beast came along. So here we ran the first global assessment of student learning outcomes. It was organised by the OECD in Paris, but we had about 18 countries all around the world doing it. And what we basically did is in the field of generic skills, economics and engineering, tested students in their 3rd or 4th year of studies. We gave them the test on a computer, all across the Sinai Desert during the coup in Egypt and various other countries. Actually, it wasn't all of Canada, it was just Ontario, and about 10 US states participated, organised by SHIO over in Boulder. So increasingly, I'm starting to get a sense of it's all about outcomes and success. Engagement is critical, but we've got to engage to do something. And this has just been summed up for me in a piece of work that's about to get published by this organisation called the Asian Productivity Organisation that's based in Tokyo, where we looked across 9 countries to look at how productive is higher education. We took a model that was developed by the National Academy of Science in DC, which I believe resonates with the room somewhat. And there's the report from the US side, and we generalised it. And we've got a few papers on this if it's something that's of interest. It's fiendishly difficult to find out how much education costs. The doctoral study is almost impossible to cost, which is kind of weird. Someone says, how much does it cost to do a doctorate? Very hard to give them a decent answer. So we added research in, which the US colleagues didn't do. Bill Massey is our collaborator on this work in Asia. And then education outcomes. And then you basically divide that by the institution's balance sheet. And you get a measure of productivity of the institution. How much is the institution producing education and research outcomes relative to the money that it's putting in? You can get a sense of productivity. So this, I thought, started to crystallise into a perspective on success and how we can help understand education success in a changing market that is increasingly privatised or private in nature, even when it's government funded. A perspective that I summed up in this book that I put out last year around December, just in time for Christmas, and basically said we need better information. I mean, we have a lot of information in higher education, but a lot of it's underused or misused, but a lot of it's not the right information. And some of the information that we are collecting now is information that we've been collecting for 20 or 30 years in an unconsidered sort of fashion, and we could be doing things very differently. But we also need to report that information differently. We need to report it differently so that people can make informed choices, and we can address that market for lemons issue that I referred to, which then led to the project where I first formed the collaboration with Laurie. Is this making sense so far? Yeah? It's okay? Any points of my Australians okay? Yeah? Okay. It is the Arvo. Yeah.
You can talk a little louder, I think, the folks are in the back.
Okay. So, the innovative perspective. What I basically was aware of is a lot of the stuff, although it had involved redoing, recontexting something from one country in a different way, or developing a new form of data collection or the like, was very sort of 1970s, 1980s thinking. Nothing wrong with that. It's just we've been with that now for 20 years. The rankings and the rating systems, less so the rating systems, but the ranking systems that dominate in our field were conceptualised back in the 90s and early 2000s. Data was very different. We didn't even have the internet. What's it going to look like in 20 years' time? And how can we stake a claim for how that looks in 20 years? I'll give you an example. Probably the most common, most popular, not in the US context, where you've got the US News and World Report and its ilk, but globally the most popular ranking is the Shanghai ranking. Have you heard of the Shanghai ranking? Academic ranking of world universities. It's been done by a research group, started as a government-funded research project, quite innocently, and just grew into this sort of global phenomenon. since about, I think, about 15, 16 years, there's no learning in it. Learning is, in fact, represented by the number of Nobel laureates who have been graduates of the institution, which has very little, in fact, I've never seen any scientific evidence that suggests that has anything to do with the quality of learning in a classroom. And they know it, but they just say there's no other data. Will we really not have any information on education, which is we've got about 18,000 higher education institutions in the world and about 200 are places like this, in the place I work. But there's about 200. So that leaves the vast majority for whom, or for which teaching and learning is the core business. So in the main source of information, will we really have no information about education in 20 years? I doubt it. So what does it then look like, that sort of information about education? Which led to the proposal that we put into the Australian government. These things take a long time. I think that was about 2013, so it's 4 years. And started by thinking through a little introspectively, but just thinking about what the current cracks were and what the potential for seeding a little bit of innovation was domestically in Australia, but also thinking forward in terms of the next 10 to 20 years in the field. I do other work on the nature of the academic workforce, management and leadership, what it means to be an academic, stresses and strains of being a dean and the like. I've talked a little bit about the work measuring learning and engagement and students' participation in higher education. And then there's another, pardon me, there's another piece of work I do around technical side. I'm a psychometrician, a testing guy by background. Assessment and evaluation is my master's degree. And it seemed to me that I had a sort of professional schizophrenia. You would go to conferences with measurement people, like I just was in San Antonio, Texas, but I'm not going to project this remark onto those people, but you would often go to conferences or journals in this area that had nothing to do with the student affairs type people or people interested in student learning. And oftentimes university leaders don't show up, or they have their own conferences about leadership and management, and there's a disconnect. And I thought, isn't that funny? And it's kind of good to do when I wasn't always a faculty member, I've only done that for 3 years, but even as a researcher, it's good to have 3 sort of lines of development, but in a way, shouldn't there be some way of bringing these things together? And I sort of thought, well, these are the 3 ways. What we really want to do is give people a successful experience. We have to do that. Unless people have a successful experience, and I don't just mean they get a job or they earn lots of money or the like, but contribute to community, have better health outcomes. There's a long list of things that higher education is meant to deliver to people in their communities. If we don't do it, then we failed. Or if we don't optimise. So it's not just about getting someone from 48 to 52, it's about also getting someone from 97 to 99. We want to have a role in helping people have the most successful experience they can. Leadership is essential to that. Even in very anarchical, devolved, collegial environments, leadership sets the whole milieu in which these sorts of conversations happen. And we need data, increasingly big data, to help make this happen. And really, we need to start joining all this stuff up. And there's problems with each of those 3 areas currently, which I'll just skip through very briefly. With regards to our talking about students, we still refer to people in groups. Batches, male. You have racial batches in this country. We don't have that in Australia, but you have racial batches. Age batches, disadvantaged batches, or advantage batches, So we need to move beyond those groups. I don't think that my iPhone thinks of me as a group. I think it knows me very, very well. It's probably even just knowing that I'm jiggling it right now. And it knows that it's me jiggling it. We need to think more about having evidence that drives leadership behaviours. Compared with the for-profit industries, there's a complete disconnect. I'm not suggesting money should be connected with leadership behaviours in higher education, that certainly plays a role, but how about connecting research and learning outcomes, as I suggested with regards to the productivity work. And we need to move forward in terms of the sort of data we're using. Now, For a guy that's developed a lot of surveys, I sort of just took a about turn and said, very 1970s, 1980s, let's look forward to new sorts of data. Just by way of a very brief passing example, this is in fact the course experience questionnaire scales that I flicked up before. I'm not going to go into this in any detail, but these are the sort of groups. And for those of you who have a statistical inkling or interest, that's the R squared. It's tiny. We're not explaining anything with these groups. This never explains anything. Over hundreds and hundreds of data collections, I've never seen this explain anything. Gender is on every survey in the world and it never really explains anything. Well, it explains something in terms of salary, but generally speaking doesn't explain stuff in terms of experience. But what you can see here is this is actually DFOE's detailed field of education. It's part of the ISCED classification. It's the International Classification of Education. It's department level, so maths, chemistry. You can see here that we can start to explain some variation, but basically we're only explaining at most 10 to 15% of what we've asked people. Okay? There's a failed communication going on. And response rates are terrible. So in some cases we can hope to get about 30%, but for the most part we generally, these days from a survey, get about 10, 15, 20%. Okay? So let me put it this way, if you invite 100 people to a party, 80 decide not to show up, and the 20 that do show up, you understand about 5% of what they're saying. And the others are speaking in foreign languages that you don't understand, don't speak. Okay? We're not having communication. And this is the data that's used to drive continuous improvement in higher education. So it's not working. So I was saying, well, we need to do better. So we put together this study that did these things, or at least aspired to do these things. Although actually we must have got something right because we handed the report into the government in July last year and the minister's still sitting on it. So hopefully it'll be out soon, but I think we can put it in the past tense. And that's what we sought to do. New ideas, new data sources, and then new ways of engaging institutions. And this was just the flow of work that we worked through. And we had a lot of different institutions participating in the actual core work of the project, including Phil Long in Texas, which is how I got to know, who used to work here, which is how I got to know Laurie. And this is the actual focus and scope of the project. Essentially to develop new concepts about students. They're quite ambitious, but why not? And then new methods, so new sorts of data. Okay? And we staged the project empirically by asking students, summarising the next slide, about an institutions, what they characterised as success, how they understood student identity, what sort of data was around, how they used the data. There's no point in coming up with something that's 20 years ahead of any practice. We want to be just riding the next wave, or at least spotting the next beach. And then what sort of leadership models did they use for understanding how they could help students succeed? And what were the best ways for changing, or at least improving leadership? And went around the country, by and large, although of course consulting with all sorts of people around the world, about how we can start to build a better understanding of student success. So we have, well, there's 40 universities, but about another 130 higher education providers who aren't universities in Australia. And we involved 30 of them in the study, interviewed students, went and visited sites to actually look around and see how people were characterising student success. What did successful student experiences look and smell like? And then ran a lot of seminars and the like. And then came out with this. So there's essentially 3 policy recommendations, which I'm not going to dwell on, but what I will go through in some detail, but reasonably quickly, is this architecture here. So it's a leadership architecture for student success. Now there has been work on student success in the US, but outside of the US, nothing. It's not a term that's used. And where it's usually used in terms of helping disadvantaged people get from 48 academically or economically disadvantaged people engage in higher education and prosper. But as I said, let's broaden the idea. So there's an enhancement framework, the 9 qualities model, the data experience leadership model, and the institutional maturity framework. And I'll talk through each of them. First of all, the Enhancement Framework is basically just a continuous improvement framework. So it's about creating understanding and purpose around a specific initiative amongst all the millions that happen every single moment in the institutions, taking stock of what needs to be done, prioritising enhancement initiative, implementing enhancements with fidelity, that means in ways that they're intended to be done at the outset, and then making sure that they're done, doing some sort of evaluation. And that is a process of creating a culture of success within the institution. So the idea is, and when we did our workshops around Australia, we would help institutions pick particular initiatives and see how they could transform that in a way that enhanced students' outcomes. Defining student success was probably the most interesting part of the project. There is no such conceptualisation so far as we could tell. So it was wide open, what I'd call a blue ocean. Okay? There was no contested theories. It was space for us to colonise. And we did that in a whole range of ways and came up with these 9 things. These are the things that seemed, from the students, the literature, the experts, to bottle up student success. Okay? I'm not going to talk through them in any detail, but hopefully they're fairly self-explanatory. Does your higher education experience create opportunities and connections? Does it help you achieve things? Does it change your identity? Does it help you feel enabled? Is it personalised? Etc., etc. These are things that we then underpinned by certain, I'll show you in the next slide after this, certain characteristics, but also certain data elements from the institutions. This is absolutely critical. As I said before, moving beyond groups. So in a way, there's no point, well, I see a decreasing point. It's probably better than nothing, but I'm not too sure, in having a data collection that people haven't engaged with, that doesn't explain anything and is reported like it's a fact. And that could be anything. It could be a standardised test, could be a survey, could be a count of people using a certain resource. A sort of fascinating data collection. There's a court near the Frank Gehry building, I guess. I don't know what the name of the court is. And I was just sitting there, just watching the world go by as I was walking over. And it said it was recording my Wi-Fi patterns. Have you seen that? Do you know the court? Yeah. Actually, this came out at my institution, because Cisco or whoever knows that we're sitting here because of that thing up there, right? Yeah. So Australians have a slightly different take on this. So the privacy concerns that made the media, that the university was looking at students in that way. But anyway, it was being done as a research study out here. There's one institution in Australia that tracks all of its students in this way, so it can tell where they're engaging, and it can offer all sorts of interventions if it feels like they're starting to fade. But that's generally the idea. We need to start looking at people in a much more fine-grained way as individuals. Not impossible to do. We're just not doing it in higher education. I'm not going to go through this in any detail, but just to show you the sort of mapping that we use to underpin these sort of glossy PowerPoints, which are all in the report if you're interested in reading further, in terms of defining what we mean by these 9 things, and then in terms of the data that's available, and then the data needs that need to be built up so that we can start to progress the conversation over the next 10 to 20 years and think differently than we were in the 1970s about students. To make a dent on some progress in this front, we developed this model. So that resonates with the model that I had earlier, and how we link all of that up is absolutely essential. We need leadership that creates student success. We need data that informs leadership that creates, it's all big happy family of joined up circles over there. But somehow we need to give some traction underneath that so institutions and people across institutions can do something about it. Part of it is getting data and joining it up into metrics and dashboards and then creating indicators and interventions to actually make a difference. And another part of it is using what we would term the institutional maturity framework, where we basically, from our field work, we're able to come up with different learning levels for the institutions or departments or the faculties based on each of those 3 areas. So an institution could diagnose where they were and hence where they had to make a strategic improvement. Okay. A very quick survey of a 2-year project. The next steps. Well, really generating better information for people to use. The information in large part is there. There is a need for some further developments, but a lot of it's there. I've said a lot about this already. The information we're largely relying on was designed usually 20 or 30 years ago. We're currently starting to see these emerge, principally only in the US, okay? The front runner of information in this space, a lot of commercial and NGO and governmental activity and institutional activity. And the interest here is in these things. What's the fourth generation look like? Yeah.
What would you consider examples of each of these?
When I went and did a study abroad at Queen's University in Canada in 1996, I had to literally go and get a book off a shelf and compare books. Paper, the current international rankings, collect data that's like 2 or 3 years old, the more dynamic sorts of reports that we're currently now using. It blurs a bit, but some of these are like dynamic rankings where you can enter bits of information and slightly customise it for you. PayScale, if you've not used that, have you used PayScale? It's a US site, so you can put in your details and it'll benchmark your pay, something like that. Here is completely customised. I have 2 daughters, 3 and 6. I hope by the time I'm deciding where they're going to study, I'll be able to say who they are, what they want to do, what sort of people they want to interact with, and it'll come back with a customised thing. Butler service. Probably online butler service, but butler service. Yep. And of course, we already have that in a lot of industries, right? You know, I mean, I've been using Expedia to hire cars as I travel around the US, right? So that's already there. We just don't have it in our game. But we need it. So this is what we need. We need ways, just sort of articulating what I've just said, we need ways of articulating the value of higher education and how we can customise that for individuals. It's invariably going to involve them coming to an institution. You know, 15, 20 years ago, we had books about the death of the physical university and the growth of the virtual university, and we've closed down computer labs in the meantime. Campuses are really important. People love learning with other people. But they're going to intersect that, as we already do, all of us, with other forms of learning. And so we need new sorts of platforms. This is our current thinking. Probably we want people to go in and tell us about their success, what sort of success they want in these areas. You know, finding a spouse is a big part of higher education. Yeah? Academic success, of course, leadership qualities, all sorts of professional outcomes. What sort of experiences they want along the way, and then what they're bringing to the table. And you can imagine there could be some engine out there that starts to make some alignment and does exactly what I just suggested. I expect my daughters should be able to do by the time they're going to college in 12 years' time. And indeed, it might actually give a report back to students. So these are the 9 qualities before, and you can see how you might start to go into a course of study by saying, this is me, and gosh, I need to do a little bit more on my achievement or get some more value. Who can I find to help me do that? And you can see LinkedIn, as in Microsoft, already starting to give these sort of business analytics, and we need to do that in terms of education analytics. Give much more dynamic information so people can structure and challenge and support their own cultivation into the future. The 3 policy recommendations I mentioned very briefly. Institutional reshaping, that's just the application of the enhancement framework. A student advisory, which is basically the website or the app or whatever it will look like in 20 years' time. It'll probably be something different. And a student agency, as in a thing, an organisation that works for students. We have never had one. Most countries have never had one. The UK is setting one up. I mean, the governments would be the closest, but that's pretty circuitous through voting patterns and the like. All of this so that we can start to do higher education in ways that close the loop, avoid the hunch, and start to actually make genuine improvements. So we've sort of got through that phase in this piece of work. We're starting to look to what sort of infrastructure to develop, and then, of course, the next stages in terms of changing discourse about student success and changing practice, and then indeed accelerating improvement. And I think I'll leave it there. Thank you. I think Molly's going to make the slides available, and you're very welcome to take them off the website if you want. Yeah.
The slides will be available. And we have a few moments for questions if folks are anything for Dr. Coates.
Mm-hmm.
Lori sent me a study a couple of years ago from Purdue. They had surveyed tens of thousands of college graduates, had their own metrics for success in college. One of the results that struck me was that the values of these various metrics, and they seem pretty reasonable, it's like financial success, social success, so on, was that there was no measurable distinction among the students who went to the top 100 U.S. News universities and those who went somewhere else. They were equally healthy, equally happy, so on and so on. We're not a low-cost provider, and so we should probably understand that data. I wonder if you had seen it or if you had any thoughts.
I think it's, my colleague Vic Borden at Indiana has shared it with me, but it's a while back. It's the Purdue Gallup study, I think.
You have to pay to get the data. All you can get is their very brief summary of it.
Yeah.
Without paying.
Yeah. What's the unique value proposition? MIT's fairly clear to everyone around the world. So what is the unique value proposition? It's not just financial. But it's as we move to having more power on the side of the students, it's time to rethink, including how we admit students. You know, it's just about a month ago in Beijing, and they have the biggest student aptitude test in the world. You know, trumps the SAT in terms of numbers, and you know, they're thinking, is that sole statistic the best metric for determining someone's future? You know, and hence trying to expand some of these notions. So I think it's a much more complex future, and a future that's not going to be driven by research metrics in terms of their feedback into education decision making. And there's enormous opportunities there, I think. Income's one of it, but I think most of us haven't made rational decisions about education, so I can't see why that's going to change. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah, I have a fundamental problem with this, and,
Yep.
and that is that it seems to me that it's treating education too much like it's a consumer product, right? And you know, it's kind of constrained in its outlook.
Yep.
And it's looking to support maybe institutions in a society which is fundamentally these days unfair. And that students, many students, I think, you know, and this is like 2 generations down from me, but, you know,
Yep.
child of the 60s, right?
Yep.
It's that the transformative nature of, potential nature of education, right, is kind of, it's going to be hard to get at that. You know, I think students come to universities, you said expectations are not met. Well, I think the students who are out marching on the streets these days for, you know, fundamental change in our society, you may not get at it with this.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think that our game, I don't know what to call it, and I'm reluctant to call it an industry based on your remark, but it's not more than an industry, right? Our thing, higher education, I don't think it's ever going to be like it was in the 60s. Even at their elite institutions, people are making very transactional decisions. Yeah, I agree, students aren't as radical as they were. They hardly ever march through campus anymore where I am. Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Hamish. We've run out of time, so thanks again for being here.